Hey guys, so for this part of the series, we'll be diving into unit testing within the Flutter suite. So fortunately, it won't be as heavy as the previous videos where we actually ran the app against a simulator. So in this case, it will just be unit testing, external dependencies as well as some functions and its logic. So yeah, got the branch pushed out, the sixth part. So initially we'll be starting off the fifth part of the branch and then work our way up towards here. So if you want to pull down the latest changes, I actually made a last minute change that wasn't covered in the previous parts video. Basically just to make the news API clients package more testable. So fortunately, I was able to create a custom class here. Basically has our instance of the client and then a universal getter function for the requests where we just pass in the source ID. So yeah, as you'd expect, this is like ideal for dependency injection and then unit testing in our case. Okay, so if you want to pull that down, that'd be more than helpful. By the way, let me know what your thoughts are on this new GitHub's dark mode. Leave in the comments below. Fortunately, I've actually got used to it compared to the first time I played around with it, so it's really not that bad. Okay, so without further ado, I do have the D&D Headlines app here with the latest changes I did mention for the news API repository class here. And then we'll basically be referencing all of our the video's content from the docs here. So if you go to the docs page and then the testing section, we'll be presented with like an intro here where it covers unit testing, widget testing, integration testing. So for the next part in the series, we'll be covering widget testing. Okay, so here's some trade-offs between those types of testing, and then here's the one we'll be working towards. We'll start off with testing one of our helper functions, and just to make sure that the logic and functionality of it works out. And then for mocking out external dependencies, I'll get more into this later. But we won't be here's a shortened disclaimer, but we won't be mocking out the dependency or for instance the live service call of the news API client, just because it's not really mockable in the unit test. So rather we'll be using widget testing just for that, because we could actually map it against an output to make it testable. So for now, we will just be unit testing the live service call function as is. But for now, we could go right into the unit testing part. So if you click that, we'll be presented with step-by-step things on how to get started. So going down the list, if you go to the first step, we just basically want to download this dependency from the Flutter's test package. So all it is in their pub.dev page. Then go to the installing. So you just want to copy and paste this under the dev dependencies package or section rather in the pubspec.yaml file. So not to confuse, but flutter_test, this is actually shipped with the Flutter SDK by default. So not sure if you guys noticed, but the widget test, that's basically testing us the sample increment counter app to run and test that widget. So we'll be working on this for the next part, but for now, just to be clear, the unit test will be the test package itself, just like that. Okay, so thanks to VS Code, we could just let Flutter or the Flutter pub get downloaded automatically. You'll see some GUI down here. Yeah, so Flutter pub get. Okay, so as soon as we download that, we're going down to number 2. We'll need a file to test, right? Or a function in our case. So here is, I don't know if you guys remember, but the helper functions file. Basically what it did was calculate the time difference between the article it was published, right? So if I go to Postman here and the sample response of the get call, here's the publish ad property, and then notice that you presented a UTC timestamp of when, that's an accident, of when the article is published, right? So this kind of timestamp, for instance. So basically compared that to the time now and just based off and compared the difference in days, hours, minutes, and seconds. Okay, so we'll just be testing this function for now. So why don't we go back to the docs and then create a test file. So maybe call something like helper functions test.dart. Okay. So now we need to, okay, so we need code like this to test. So all it is like your good old main function here. Let's just copy and paste that just to refactor into our own way and keep these simple. So here's the test package we just imported and downloaded. So, okay, so to start things off, we have a test block here, right? So say what the first thing we could test is maybe like the time difference something was published, or like the time difference compared to a different time in days for now, okay? So here in this string, you could, this is the name of the function. So maybe we could call something like difference has days ago. So we don't need these. And then the assertion, right? Which is basically an expect function. And then the actual value against the matcher helper. So that's, we can initialize a value here. Let's just comment that out right now. Okay, so just initialize a value here. Call our helper functions class, and then the function here. And then just to like, maybe we want to get a sample timestamp for now, just because historically it's not really fun to work with these in the first place. So here's a sample. Let's create it to how we want it. So let's just make it like the first day of the year, January 1st. And then zeros for the time. Okay, so that's our time difference instance. Uncomment that out now that we have a variable. So maybe considering that this is a string, let's check and see based on the timestamp here. If we pass that in to this function here, with the other time, we want to compare with the time today, right? Which is in this case December 26, 2020. So you'd expect this block will be fired off, right? Because we just want to return one type at a time, right? So if it's more than one day, we'll be returning text like this. Okay, so something like days ago, right? From this part here. Okay, and then the matcher will just be true to just ensure that this text instance here contains days ago. Okay, so why don't we set up some breakpoints now and then see where that lands. All right, so using one of VS Code's cool features, we could press this debug GUI. And then ideally, it'll fire off the breakpoints one by one. Okay, so we open up our debug console. Here's the test panel within the VS Code. So here's the first breakpoint that's fired. Let's go to our the debug panel here to see the data that's been compared. So here's the days based on the times of difference. So we have 360 days, which is about right. So considering that it fulfills this condition, it'll return the string interpolation of the days and days ago as one text, right? So the function that's returned, or the string that's returned, will contain that text. Okay, and then here's what's returned 360 days ago, which contains the text. So it'll be true, hence it'll pass. Okay, so there it is. So 1 out of 1 passed. Okay, cool. So why don't we write a few more tests just to keep this suite reliable. Okay, so we could copy and paste this here. So instead of comparing against days, why don't we try hours? Okay, so an idea is we'll use the same time difference instance, and then we wanna see if just ensure that the hours ago text is not contained, considering that we have more than one day, which going down the priority, only the days will be fired off, right? So we want to make sure this is false, considering that it won't be returned. Okay, so breakpoints and debug this test. Okay, so that was the first test that was run. And then notice that the days is still 360. Okay, so we were expecting hours ago, right? We're asserting against that, but considering that it's the same value for this instance, it'll return false. Test results, 2 out of 2 passed. Cool. All right, so we should probably rename this to something like difference does not hours ago. All right, third time the charm, the final test. Instead of like just comparing against the time difference based on if it's days or hours or so on and so forth, we could maybe utilize this try catch block that's written in this function here. So notice that if it's caught, we're just simply printing it, right? And then soon after we return an empty string. So we could try asserting against that now. So just keeping this in mind that we have a valid format for a date, right? Why don't we intentionally ruin the format of it just to forcefully, return an empty string after it's caught? Okay. So instead of containing or checking against that the instance contains a certain text, why don't we assert the value of it being an empty string? All right. So we can rename this to something like difference parsing error catch turns empty string. Okay, so let's run that. All right, cool. So notice that it's caught in this block due to this invalid format, and then returning the empty string, which will be successful here. And just to confirm, 3 out of 3 passed. Let's see, going back to the docs, step 5. So there's something what's called a group. Basically is where you wrap all the tests within a group block, just to divide the tests out based on logic. So in this case, we'll just be wrapping this in one group for simplicity and for the sake of this tutorial. All right, so we could just wrap this in a group and then name it accordingly. Okay. So let's cut and paste what we just wrote into the sample test. We copy and paste it from the docs. Get the indentation down. Okay, cool. And then we can rename the group to something like time difference logic. All right, just to be sane, let's set up the same breakpoints we had earlier. And then we could either debug from this group or debug from the main function. But we could maybe debug the group for starters and just make sure that all of the tests go down and get executed incrementally. So here's the first one. Second test. Okay, and there it is. The time difference logic group, the test that was just passed. Cool. All right. And then lastly, you have the options. So I use VS Code. You could either run the test from the start debugging option, kind of like what I did in the previous parts of this tutorial series, or you could run the test against the terminal. So we could do that just for showcasing purposes. So all it is if you want to run the test, it's just flutter test command and then the test package. and then the file. And then ideally we should see, yep, like this, something like this. All tests have passed. And then our error log from the parsing error. Okay, cool. So that's it for testing out the function. Why don't we go on to the more interesting part? Okay, and that part is, like I said earlier, we won't be mocking out the external dependency or the news API client package in this case, due to some like limitations with what we can do with unit testing. So yeah, so if you go to like this part of the unit testing doc, it just mentions like the reason why you want to mock, or in this case use the Mockito package to mock out your dependencies. Here's some caveats, but just to be clear, we'll be unit testing the live service. So go back to pub.dev and then type in news API client. If you go to the GitHub repo here, how this API was written, it's not really testable. So if you wanted to, like, hence why I wrote, refactor the news API repository to look like this for later on. We'll be basing off the test for now, just something like this. So here's his client instance, and then we have something similar like that. For this case, our own repo. Okay, so we'll be referencing this samples in the next part. But for now, we could just stick with this, just because widget testing will be more friendly to the test for the output. Could do something like what we did before, such that we created a new test file here. Call something like get top headline test.dart. Okay, and then we could create our main function here. Okay, and then here's a sample test block. We could refactor to our own way. All right, so I was thinking we could just simply call out the get call from the repo instance. So to get started, we could initialize it here as a global field throughout the file. So news API repository. So for starters, this test, we could just simply deserialize a headline object after we get it or request it from the API. So maybe call something like this for starters. Deserializing response to headline type. Okay, and then considering that we'll be calling the get call for a future, we'll need to wrap this in a async block. So async, and then let's just initialize a value here, which is basically the response of what we request. So from the repository in this case, get top headlines, and then we'll just be hard coding this for now. Okay, and then that'll be the response, right? Cool, and then let's just assert that the object that was returned is just is a headline type. So we have this cool helper function from the test package to make sure that the response is deserialized to a headline object. Okay. Okay, so I should be putting this in the type accents here and then importing it. Fix that, cool. All right, so if I run this test, it'll ideally return me a headline type, considering that this is a live service call, so we're not mocking anything yet. So if I debug this, And then we could also set breakpoints here, considering that we're testing this function or external dependency. All right. So here's the headline type that's returned. Okay, so notice that successfully deserialized from this helper from JSON function we had in our model class. Next breakpoint, and then we assert that the object deserialized is a headline type. Okay, so notice that it passed for this file here. Okay, cool. So as I mentioned with the shared preferences, external dependency, we could actually mock it out. So we could put it in what's called a setup block here. As you'd expect, this runs before every test that's run down the list. So it'll look something like this, and then it'll be shared preferences instance, then set mock initial values. So all it is we're passing in a map, I believe. Yep, a map. Okay, so map, and then if you remember, we could use our strings constants file and use the new source pref key, which will just be something like this, and then it'll be mapped to a value of Google News, right? Semicolon. So what this does is going down this under the hood of how it works is basically it's data that's stored in the memory and it doesn't persist across application restarts. So as it says here, this is useful in unit tests. So this is exactly what we want instead of caching the values every time, right? So that's how you mock values for shared preferences. But say if I wanted to access it, right, just to make sure we get what we want. So to get an instance there first, and then if the mock value really is successfully set before this test is run, we could try accessing it here and then use the same key, right? But so if I run this, right, it'll ideally work, right? But if I wanted to access it before it's mocked, you'll see what happens. It's actually interesting, the logs that are displayed once it crashes. But for now, the source ID that's passed is Google News. So notice that it will successfully cache, and then we accessed it. Loads, and then returns the headline. And then that test should pass, right? But say if I comment out this function here and then try to run it again, you'll see that it won't work. Okay, so we have a pref instance. And then this is what you're presented with. Okay. And then if I try to continue, it'll just go deeper down the hood and show you all causes of why it crashed. Alright, so it's absolutely essential to invoke this first and then access the key value pair of what's stored. Okay, cool. So that's our first test for this live source function. Now we could, I guess, copy and paste this function. And then maybe, we could maybe go to our model function, or model class rather, and then access some of the helper functions we wrote throughout this file. So maybe something like this get article source name, right? So if you remember, we just access the first article in the list and then access the source object and then the name. So why don't we try asserting that the name of this helper function returns the value we're comparing against. Okay. So maybe call it something like headlines article. Oh, escape that apostrophe first. Source name matches. Okay. Okay, so the response, we could just simply invoke the function here. Maybe set up some breakpoints here. All right. And then we won't be needing this type matcher helper function here. So considering that it's Google News, going back to Postman, we want something like this, right? So we could actually copy and paste this into there. All right. So let's set the breakpoints accordingly and debug. So notice that the key value pair is stored before this test is run. Okay, get our headline response. Okay, and then this helper function will run, right? So here's our headline instance, and then the article list, and then the source name that was accessed from the first article. So source name Google News, and notice that that's what we asserted. So going back, and then the test results panel, notice that it passed right here. Headline article source name matches. Cool. All right. And then of course we could wrap these two tests in a group, including this setup function here. So going back to our other test. Wrap in the group here. All right, and then maybe rename this group to something like get top headlines Google News from cache source pref ID. All right, so just to like test more against this API even more with some other edge cases, we could, why don't we try testing against some other news source? Okay, so maybe something like Ars Technica. So here's our sample responses from this source. All right, and then it'll be very similar to how we have in this group. So figured I'd copy and paste this somewhere below here. Okay, and then the parameter name, group parameter name of this is just simply Ars Technica, so like that. And then maybe change this to Ars Technica from Google News. Okay. And then this will be Ars Technica here. Cool, so why don't we set breakpoints here? So just debug this group. So notice that the Ars Technica data is being retrieved. Source name Ars Technica. Okay, notice that it passed. Okay, cool guys. So that's all I had for this video. Notice that it wasn't that much. But like I said earlier, we'll be actually testing against mocking the dependencies with Mockito. That way it's easier with widget testing. So, but for now, just to like give you guys a glimpse of how unit testing works for intro purposes, as well as like getting this repo class in as a setup and segue for the next part. So I figured this would be a good starting point for moving on with all things testing. So widget testing, and then ultimately down to integration test. All right. So that's all I had for now. If you guys have any questions, as always, feel free to post a comment below or reach me via Twitter. My handle is in the description. And we'll see you guys next time. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks. Bye.